We're all set, Madam Chair.
Great, excellent. Then I am gaveling this working session of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. For the record, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 City Councilor and also the Ways and Means Chair for the Council. This working session is being recorded. It's being live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. The Council's budget review process encompasses about 35 working sessions and hearings. The hearings are where we can hear from the department directly. The working sessions, like today, are a chance for the council to sort of generate some questions that we're sending over in advance to the administration so that we can have those hearings be as informative as possible. So not at these working sessions, but at the hearings throughout the process, we do encourage public testimony and participation. So if you want to find out how to testify, you can go to boston.gov/council-budget. That'll give you the whole schedule of hearings. And also you can figure out how to testify from there, or you can go to boston.gov/budget-testify for that instructions directly. You can shoot us an email at ccc.wm@boston.gov. ccc.wm@boston.gov with questions about how to testify, with your written testimony attached. That'll all become part of the record. And we're also having 2 dedicated budget public testimony hearings more towards the end of the process. One on the 25th of May, focused on the Boston Public Schools, and then one on the 3rd of June, focused on any aspect of the budget. And those are both at 6 p.m. and we go straight to public testimony, so you don't have to wait for the presentations. So you'd be welcome at any of those. You can also submit a 2-minute video online on our website, which will play after the hearing. I just need to submit that 48 hours in advance of any given hearing. And then if you use the hashtag BOSSBudget, BOS budget, we will answer questions and stuff that we get from Twitter and other social media as well. So with that, today's working session is on dockets 0524 to 0526, orders for the FY22 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, for the school department, and for other post-employment benefits. Docket 0527 to 0528, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations. Docket 0529 to 0531, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. Docket 0532 to 0534, orders authorizing limits for BPS revolving funds. And docket 0546, an order authorizing an appropriation from the Boston Equity Fund. So the focus of today's working session, that's sort of the whole set of dockets. The actual focus is a couple of the BPS, 3 actually of the BPS strategic plan commitments: accelerate learning, amplify all voices, and expand opportunity. So that's basically a set of BPS topics that we'll be covering in the BPS hearings on the 18th of May, focused on kind of all the academic stuff in our schools, and then also parent and youth engagement and governance, school admission and assignment system, build BPS and our sort of future capital planning. And then you heard the mention of the BPS revolving funds, which the council also needs to authorize. And I guess I'll read into the record. The sort of topic areas for the academic stuff is early education, including universal pre-K, the Office of Elementary Schools, Office of Secondary Schools, excellence for all and advanced work classrooms, science education, literacy, vocational education, art and music, libraries, special curricular programs, Mass Core standards, MCAS, COVID-19 learning loss replacement, graduation and career readiness, credit recovery, and age 22. So looking forward to all that. And then, so we'll talk about BPS, and then we'll also be talking about the Department of Neighborhood Development, which is really our housing department in the city, and then the Office of Fair Housing and Equity, and then also the Office of Economic Development and its Boston Equity Fund, and then the Office of Women's Advancement, which doesn't always come before us, but it's going to come before us along with OED this year because they have a significant increase in their budget for the year. So those are the topics. And just so, you know, if you're watching at home and you're like, this is sort of a strange hearing, why don't I see anybody presenting? Because of the open meeting law, it's important that when the council gets together to generate questions like this, that we do it publicly. And so that's why you see it on video and we'll put it on the record. And my apologies in advance if it's a little dry. So I'm going to jump into reading some of the questions that have come in from counselors who aren't able to make it today, so that they're on the record. So I'll start with the BPS ones, and then we'll go to DND. And I'll just ask the staff who are on the call to let me know again if one of my colleagues joins. So from Councillor Julia Mejia at large on the BPS Commitment 2 topics, which are the academic ones. One question is, in regards to job preparedness, how are we working with local unions and vocational organizations to help the next generation of tradespeople get the certifications they need before they graduate from BPS? And then in terms of graduation rates, we're seeing some of the lowest graduation rates in Boston Day and Evening Academy and at BATA. What are we doing to ensure that adults who are going through BPS are retained and prepared to graduate? And then we're seeing a 27% reduction in reading according to the program details for FY22. How does that align with our goal of boosting literacy, or can the department explain that line item reduction? And then our office recently filed a task force to boost literacy rates and to improve services for people who cannot read or write in any language, either due to disability or because of stunted education. Any initial thoughts or responses to that idea from BPS? Then we're seeing reductions in spending for mathematics and math support, science and social studies. What is the reasoning behind these cuts and how are they aligned with BPS Commitment 2? And then what are we doing to make sure that every school has access to arts and music education and that those programs reflect the diversity, the diversity of backgrounds in our students. And then on the commitments in 3 and 4 topics, which are more the governance and the capital budget and such, Councillor Mejia asks, our office attended a meeting in the Jackson Man on Wednesday, and the parents that were there were very upset about the lack of clarity regarding the future of that school leading up to that particular meeting. How are we making sure that parents, students, and teachers are being brought along in the decision-making processes and are not simply informed after the fact? Then when a school is shut down, such as the McCormick or the Jackson Man, how are we ensuring that the students are provided socio-emotional support and that they are being kept in their neighborhood? And then how are we ensuring that all schools have a school site council and that these councils are open to parents from all different backgrounds, including parents who speak languages other than English, parents of students in special education, and parents who may work during nights and weekends? And then turning now on BPS questions to Councillor Ricardo Arroyo from District 5. Councillor Arroyo asks, what is the status of BPS's partnerships with Youth on Board? Is the Boston School Committee funded through BPS's budget? If so, does the funding come from the central office? And can we get a breakdown of the budget for the school committee? If funding from the school committee comes from BPS, has BPS put aside a part of the central office budget for a stipend for the Boston School Committee student representative? Has BPS put aside any portion of the budget to allow for the school student representative to receive a stipend? And then does BPS plan on releasing a comprehensive detailed report on Build BPS progress? How often is the Build BPS plan revisited, if at all, in order to make adjustments? And then on BPS revolving funds, for the facilities revolving fund, BPS expects to spend $760,000 by the end of the fiscal year, but had only spent $94,812 by May 31st. So that's less than $100,000 versus $760,000 budgeted. Is BPS still on track to spend that amount, and what does BPS anticipate this funding will go towards, i.e. repairs, maintenance, et cetera? And how does BPS determine where, as in which schools, the expenditures are directed towards from the revolving fund, or does the revenue go into a general fund for use by the school district as a whole? For the technology revolving fund, BPS expects to spend $15,000 by the end of the fiscal year, but had not spent any funds as of May 31st. Is BPS still on track to spend that amount, and why had none of the receipts been spent by 3/31? For the technology revolving fund in the prior fiscal year, expenditures were about $50,000 above the receipt amount. Can the department explain this discrepancy? Was it due in part to the purchase of computers for remote learning? And then for the transportation revolving fund in the prior fiscal year, expenditures were about 5.5 times higher than the receipts. Are the expenditures covered by the operating budget and specifically the transportation portion of the BPS budget? So thank you to Councillor Arroyo for asking some of the questions about revolving funds. For folks watching at home, revolving funds are these segregated funds that that departments have where they take in some income and then they spend that income on it. So for instance, if people rented BPS facilities and paid some fees for that, then we use that money to clean the facilities more. So it's like a related purpose. And so it's not tax dollars that the council approves there, but the council does approve the limits for those and do some annual scrutiny just to make sure those don't become kind of unaccountable vague kind of funds that are sitting out somewhere. So thank you, Councilor Royo, for asking about those. And then I will read some questions of mine about BPS, and then we'll do DND and OFHE. So, I think my biggest question is, there's been a lot of back and forth about learning loss and emotional trauma through the pandemic, and to me, it's fairly non-controversial that we've had both. And I think that I think the question for me is, what are we going to do early in the term next year to figure out where all of our students are in terms of what supports they need, both academic and social and emotional, and then to put those into place, right? So it's like, it feels like almost like every student in our care and BPS needs like an assessment and an action plan. And I think, yesterday we did the working session related to more of the social and emotional health side, and that's going to be important, but also the academic side is going to be really important. Like where, if somebody just couldn't, there's somebody who really needs that kind of teacher over their shoulder to learn a math concept, and they haven't had that, figuring that out and then figuring out like, oh, this is somebody who could use some math tutoring to get them back on track, I think is so important. And I think it's super important for our students not to internalize, if people had a hard time learning in a topic or a subject over this pandemic year, and then they come back, if we don't meet with them with that kind of support that says like, oh, of course, this was a really crazy year for learning these things, I think students very easily internalize kind of struggling on something and not being at grade level or where their peers are as something wrong with them. And I think we could have a lot of kids sort of turn away from liking school because they feel like they're behind and they're just supposed to pretend that they're not. So yeah, we'd just really like to understand sort of both what we're planning to pay for in terms of extra academic supports, where the federal funds are coming in for that with the year, but also how we're kind of going to figure out where everybody's at, and support our teachers in that work. Which, I think they every year come in September and are trying to figure out where the variety of students they're teaching are kind of at in different topics and learning styles. But it feels like that need for kind of initial diagnostics is going to be even more intense. So we'd love to have the district really speak to that, and speak some more to the summer. Just on the academic front. So I think we'll have talked about that. That was in the other one, but just that's going to be an important thing. And then specifically for high school students as well, like, I think that's where we've seen the most drop off from remote learning. And so like, what's our particular plan for kind of supporting our high school students and getting them back to, when we talk about learning loss, there's a lot of sort of question of eye of the beholder and who's, what's the metric we're using, et cetera. But I think we all know that college readiness and the ability to graduate and to go on to 2 or 4 year college institutions, if that's what students want, is a pretty key metric for high school students, and it's coming up on people faster, right? So I just would love to understand how the district's thinking about that. On the Build BPS front, just really want a really thorough update. I know that they will have presented to school committee the week prior. So hopefully there'll be a presentation from that and we can build off of that. But yeah, just where we're going next. I mean, we've been talking about Build BPS and that first billion for a long time, and that first billion's been spent several times over. And to me, we need a real vision for the district on the capital side, and it's sort of like time to be getting there. So understanding where we are and where the next steps are on that front is going to be important. And I have particular interest in what our capital plans are for the McKinley schools, and for the Kennedy Academy as well, both in my district. And then, yeah, I think I'll cut off my BPS questions there for now, and then go to some questions for the Department of Neighborhood Development. So from Councilor Julia Mejia, we have heard from constituents of the BHA housing who are students living with their parents. They're in a difficult situation where unless they are enrolled full-time, they're not classified as students, and as such, their rents go up if they are earning. How can DND work with the BHA to make sure that part-time students are able to work and go to school without risking higher rents for their families? So, interested to hear what DND's take on that is. I know because I used to work at the BHA that that's probably governed by federal statute in most cases, and so would be difficult to change without a federal administrative change. But it's a good issue to raise. And then Councilor Ricardo Arroyo asks, can we get more details about the increase of $3.5 million in contracted services for FY22 in DND's budget? And then can DND go into more detail about the post-COVID homelessness support funding? And then for the Office of Fair Housing and Equity, which is going to come along with DND, Councilor Arroyo asks, can Fair Housing and Equity give a little more clarity around its full-time employees and full-time employment cost adjustments? And then many of the FHE staff are funded through external funds. Are there any plans by the administration to make at least some of these positions funded through the operating budget? How stable is the amount of external funds that support these positions? Does it sort of remain even from year to year, or does it change? To what extent is Fair Housing and Equity proactively investigating cases of discrimination in Boston rather than depending on residents to file complaints? And then are there any plans to expand funding to Fair Housing and Equity or use existing funding to allow the office to conduct studies on the behalf of Boston on housing discrimination? So those are from Councilor Ricardo Arroyo. Yeah, similarly, the council was informed last year about, I think it was a $250,000 sum that went to create a sort of initial pilot contract between Fair Housing and Equity and Suffolk University around fair housing testing, and it's doing some of that proactive work. And I think I expressed at the time that I'm very interested in how we could do something a bit more like what Seattle does, and grow into a program where we're doing fair housing testing, but then we're doing enforcement actions against landlords who we find out are discriminating, against voucher holders, against people for their color, their family status, we saw the data that transgender folks are some of those most discriminated against in housing. I would really like us to get a more ambitious plan there, and we did talk to Seattle in some detail about their program, so we'd love to know what Fair Housing is thinking about on that front. It would also be great if they could explain the average age of open cases in more details and what delays the closing of cases, and sort of whether the number of staff feels sufficient to support the caseload you have. I think some of the growth in staff may be to support that, but just addressing that a bit. And then, what the fair housing testing operation is going to look like in FY22. And do we go back and retest people, and what's been done under this partnership with Suffolk so far, and have we been doing any enforcement actions? Do we do education? What's our kind of approach? The other municipalities who we spoke with when we dug into this issue, I mentioned that they focused on testing a few types of discrimination each year, and then changing it up to make sure that all sort of topics and categories and protected classes were covered. So curious whether the office plans to instruct Suffolk to do this. And if so, what the focus areas were last year, and whether we'll be able to see the data from last year. And then, as I mentioned already, a plan for testing for discrimination against LGBTQ individuals, in particular trans folks. And then in the long term, we're very interested in a plan to sort of bring that fair housing testing operation internal. Which I think is the route that Seattle went. But first we need to have a robust thing at all, even if it's through contracts. So interested in talking about that in detail with fair housing. And then on the DND side, I know there's some progress. So I just would love an update on what's been done towards increasing education about co-ops for first-time home buyers, supporting residents who would like to be co-op members, and increasing the amount of co-ops in Boston. I think there is something being added to the training class, and there's also an effort that's maybe almost finished to start a kind of revolving fund for share loans. Would just love a full update on the co-op stuff. And then whether any of the federal funding we've received has been used to purchase residential property and keep or make it affordable. So that's sort of our AOP program in any form. Have we been using federal funding for that? Are we thinking about it? How the first generation home buyer pilot is going and whether we're thinking about expanding that. What the plan is for transitioning homeless individuals that may have been in emergency shelter, including hotels, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic into permanent housing. I know there's money in the budget. It seems to reference that. I would love to understand the details of the plan. Again, sort of housing related things. I think, housing related things that we could responsibly use rescue plan funds on that are sort of one-time things, aside from the rental relief, which we know we have a significant pot for and is going to be really critical. That'd be great. Obviously, the eviction moratorium is waffling a bit. It was struck down by a federal judge, and now there's a stay. And so, hearing about how, regardless, at some point that's going to lift. And so, thinking with DND through, what are we doing proactively to be ready for that moment and make sure we don't get a wave of evictions. And then just what they need. And the RFP they're going to do this spring related to the fair cloth stuff. That would be great to touch base on as well. All right. And then with, now I'm going to go back to the Office of Economic Development and the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement. So from Councilor Mejia, she asks about the Office of Women's Advancement. How are we using the Child Care Entrepreneur Fund to empower local entrepreneurs of color who are working in this industry? This is a new thing. The administration's there was some grant funding and had been some work around the Child Care Entrepreneur supports. And now there's $250,000, I think it is, in the budget for this fund for this year. So we definitely want to hear about that in detail. That's the reason we're having the Women's Advancement folks with us. And then in FY21, the Child Care Entrepreneur Fund is supporting its first entirely non-English speaking cohort of child care providers with workshop facilitation and materials in Spanish. So if the team can talk about how that's going, it's great to see. And what is the plan to support a cohort of providers who speak languages beyond English and Spanish? That'd be great. And then from Councilor Arroyo on the Office of Economic Development, can OED talk a little bit about some of its external funds like the Boston Cannabis Equity Fund and the Small Business Relief Fund? Where does funding for the external grants come from, and how are they supplemented by the operating budget, if at all? How have these funds been dispersed or spent in the past? Then can OED talk about the EDIC grant? The budget book says the city is awarded $500,000 each year over 3 years, but OED is projecting a $365,248 decrease from FY21. How will OED supplement this major planned decrease this year? Will OED draw from the operating budget to support the functions this grant would have otherwise covered? And what's going on there? Obviously, the EDIC is it's another quasi-city governmental entity that's sort of run in conjunction with the BPDA. So that's all a little bit in-house. So it would just be wonderful to understand what's happening with the money there. And then why is the Equity and Inclusion Program of OED set to decrease by 19%? Is this amount being transferred to a different department? If so, what parts of the program are moving? And the Boston Residents Jobs Policy piece is funded through the Equity Inclusion Program of OED. Will the decrease in personnel funding affect OED's ability to ensure compliance with the policy? So yeah, I know there's some department shifts happening around the Equity and Inclusion Cabinet, and it would be great to understand where we see real decreases and where we're just seeing a reorg and some real actual reorg diagrams and explanations for the council would be very helpful. There's some written explanations in the budget book, but I think something a little bit more visual would be helpful. And then from me, on the OED Women's Advancement front, I'll start with Women's Advancement. So definitely want to hear about the Child Care Entrepreneur Fund and that $250,000 increase. How does the Office of Women's Advancement and the Boston Women's Workforce Council work to create an inclusive and welcoming space for trans women? What has the office found to be the main barriers to increasing access to affordable and quality childcare in Boston? I know we talked about this a bit in the hearing, and the office has really done pretty cutting edge stuff, but it would just be great to understand how the Child Care Entrepreneur Fund is sort of targeted at what we learned through that fairly extensive process. And is the measure of 82 businesses receiving financial support specific to those supported by the Child Care Entrepreneur Fund last year, or is that a wider set of sources? And then I guess, since we have women's advancement and OED coming together, just would really love to hear from both of them about how we're thinking about specifically, the ways in which this pandemic has been a recession for women. And we've seen so many women not just lose their jobs, but also leave the labor force. And obviously a lot of that is connected to childcare in many cases. And so I think it's a great thing for women's advancement to be focused on and to be like ratcheting up and support in, but just would love to hear like other aspects of that, of tackling that issue that we're thinking about for the year ahead. And then questions for OED. If they could explain sort of who their category of emergency employees are who are listed, and then the $1.1 million increase in contracted services, just sort of walk through that. And then I'd really like us to talk about the Small Business Relief Fund in detail. So I feel like the council didn't do the kind of close scrutiny of that we did on the Rental Relief Fund. And so we'd really like a kind of after action report on, in the first round, like how many folks applied, how many folks got weeded out at the different stages of the process. So, like how many of these people didn't get their landlords to support their application? And then how many of these people did we weed out for some other, we're not qualified? And then, just kind of like give us a sense of the funnel. And of how much, like how many applications we had that we weren't able to satisfy, what the average amount received was, what the neighborhood distribution of those funds were, what was the sort of small minority women-owned business breakdown there. And then I am sure that we are going to end up doing a related small business relief thing, as we think about the rescue plan funds and the sort of economic side of those. I just would love to understand how OED and small business specifically within it is thinking about tweaking that process to make it better, to serve people we weren't able to serve, to think now that there is, significant federal support for businesses. There's a very major restaurant relief package that restaurants can apply for retroactively. Like, how are we thinking about what's distinctive that the city of Boston can do? Because we're never going to be able to match the federal or state level for spending. So what are the things that we feel like where we can be the difference makers? And how are we tailoring our business relief programs to think about that? And we don't have to have all the answers, but I feel like it would be helpful for the council as it sort of conducts oversight over that federal money to know what we feel like we learned from our prior business relief stuff. And the Certified Business Relief Fund as well, if we could talk through that a little bit and what the kind of difference between that and the small business thing is. And again, what the average amount people got was, did people get it multiple times, et cetera. I'll just say we got a bunch of calls about the Commercial Rental Relief Fund, just for folks who felt like it wasn't transparent. They couldn't tell why their application didn't come through. It was a tricky process. Their landlord was uncooperative, and I'm not one for giving folks a hard time when you're setting up a pilot quickly and trying to get money out the door. And I think our team's done a great job of that, but I do think we have an opportunity to make sure that we're fine tuning it for the next round. And then, I think, overall, we want to know from OED how it is thinking about what the places are that the city should be targeting economic relief, both in terms of need and in terms of potential for impact. So, I really hope that OED comes prepared to talk about that and not just its funding. We have it obviously coming for a budget hearing about its budget, but it is also about that wider economic development and relief world that we're all thinking about a lot right now. And then, just also whether we're thinking about ways to support our local businesses in applying for those bigger federal grants, like the one that lets restaurants get up to 10 million, you know, for back stuff. Like we should be making sure every restaurant in the city of Boston that's eligible is getting that. How are we kind of thinking about that piece of things? With the all-inclusive Boston campaign and us doubling down on that, I know that's in tourism, but would love to just know whether we've got like metrics on that, what we're watching, how we kind of know what success looks like there, because I know OED's been involved. And then for the workforce training, there's $1 million for training in hard hit industries. And I'm just trying to understand like what we're thinking about there. What are the hard hit industries? Is it training to get people out of those industries or improve their chances in those industries? Like, what do we mean? Because for instance, like, you know, I think lots of folks in the hospitality industry want their jobs back. I'm not clear that that's a retraining need. So would just love to understand that. And then in terms of business improvement district formation, just if they could talk a bit more about that, how that overlaps or doesn't with the Main Streets district world, and then how we're supporting businesses without a Main Streets district. That's been really hard in my district. The places we haven't had one, we've really noticed the lack of like a direct connection to the city. And the flip side is it's been great in Mission Hill where we have a Mission Hill Main Streets. And obviously the city did procure and start the process of sort of reimagining Main Streets, but I don't know where we are with that, like what's coming out of that and how do you navigate this rapidly changing landscape? So we'd love to talk through that. Yeah. So I think those are our questions for OED and DND and the schools. So I think probably what we'll do, since we had fairly light attendance today, is that we'll get these questions from me and Councilors Arroyo and Mejia typed up and over to the administration. And then we'll probably, when we have our Friday, when we have our Friday the 14th working session, I may give people an opportunity to tag in their missing questions on these, so we could at least get a second round of belated questions over to the departments, because I know it helps. But with that, I'm just going to check with staff. I don't think we've had any further questions come in. Is that right? But let me know if we have.
That is correct, Madam Chair. No one has come in with further questions.
Okay, great, excellent. Well, then I think I'm sort of inclined to gavel us out. So thank you if you were watching. Thank you to my colleagues, Councilors Arroyo and Mejia. And with that, this working session of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you. Have a good day.